There's a phrase that has been going around a lot lately, mostly on short-form video platforms, usually in big bold letters. It says, inflation is stealing your money. The premise is that every year, your money becomes less valuable, not because you are spending more, but because more money is being printed. The conclusion is that even if you save, you are losing. That feels like a very aggressive way to frame basic economics.
It is aggressive, but I actually don't think it is wrong. We are conditioned to think of saving as the ultimate financial virtue. You put the money in the bank, you leave it alone, you are doing the right thing. But the math underneath that virtue has completely broken down over the last few years. The St. Louis Fed tracks the M2 money supply, which is basically all the cash, checking deposits, and easily accessible savings in the system. If you look at the M2 chart from early 2020 to where we are now in early 2026, the money supply has increased by roughly 45%. That is a staggering influx of new currency. So when someone says your money is becoming less valuable because more is being printed, they are just describing the mechanical reality of the last 6 years. You hold the same dollar, but the pool of dollars it swims in is nearly half again as large.
That assumes a direct one-to-one relationship between the money supply and purchasing power. But the economy also grew over those 6 years. Goods were produced. It is not just the same amount of stuff with 45% more cash chasing it.
No, it is not a perfect one-to-one ratio. That is true. Economic growth does absorb some of that liquidity, but the gap between the growth of the money supply and the actual growth of the economy during that pandemic and post-pandemic window was historic. The Federal Reserve and central banks globally bought trillions in securities. They flooded the system to prevent a collapse in 2020. It stabilized the markets, but the consequence was that inflation ran incredibly hot. We saw the consumer price index peak heavily, and even now in 2026, as the Fed has played with rates to manage it, the cumulative effect remains. The prices did not go back down. They just stopped rising quite as fast. So the saver who put $100 in the bank in 2019 can look at their balance today and see maybe $110 with interest, but what they can actually buy with that money is significantly diminished.
Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows the purchasing power of the dollar declined roughly 7.4% just between 2021 and 2022 alone. The erosion is
measurable and compound. That is the part that makes this feel like theft to the average person. We think of inflation as a temporary weather event. A storm comes, prices go up, the storm passes, we go back to normal. But fiat currency is designed to perpetually lose value. The target is usually a 2% annual loss. When we hit periods like the last few years where the M2 supply rockets to over $22.7 trillion by early 2026, that erosion speeds up dramatically. The Truth in Accounting organization published an analysis last year looking at purchasing power over 50-year blocks. They found that $100 in 1975 has the purchasing power of only $16.40 today. That is an 84% decline. It completely alters the premise of what saving actually is. Saving in cash is essentially opting into a slow, guaranteed decay.
I want to stop you there. Opting into a guaranteed decay makes it sound malicious, but holding cash isn't an investment strategy. It is a liquidity strategy. People save cash because they need certainty that the nominal value will be there tomorrow when their car breaks down. They aren't trying to build wealth with it. They are buying insurance against immediate ruin.
I do understand the liquidity argument. You need an emergency fund, you need working capital, but the issue is that financial literacy for the vast majority of the public begins and ends with save your money. The concept of asset allocation, moving wealth into things that cannot be printed, like equities, real estate, or hard assets, is a secondary language that many people never learn, and the system relies on that ignorance to a degree. When inflation runs hot, it acts as a regressive tax. It disproportionately punishes the people who rely entirely on wages and bank savings. Research from the St. Louis Fed actually looked at how unexpected inflation affects household wealth, and they found a fascinating dynamic.
It makes the poorest households worse off because they spend all their income on basic necessities that are suddenly more expensive. It also negatively impacts the wealthiest households in nominal terms because they hold large portfolios of fixed income assets. But the middle class, interestingly, sometimes benefits slightly if they hold a lot of fixed rate debt, like a mortgage. The debt gets inflated away.
The International Monetary Fund published a study in 2024 about exactly that. They found most households are highly aware that inflation eats their savings, but almost completely unaware that it also erodes their debt.
Which is a massive blind spot. If you owe a bank $300,000 on a 30-year fixed mortgage at 3% and inflation runs at 6%, the real value of what you owe is dropping faster than the interest is accumulating. The bank is losing and you are winning. But because people don't conceptualize debt in real terms, they only see the grocery bill going up. They feel the pain at the pump, they feel the pain at the checkout counter, and they miss the silent balance sheet transfer happening on their mortgage. But, and this is the crucial part, that only helps you if you actually own an asset backed by fixed rate debt. If you are a renter, you get all the pain of the grocery bill and none of the benefit of the debt erosion. You are just catching the full force of the currency devaluation.
That creates a structural wealth gap based entirely on who had access to credit before the money supply expanded. The people holding assets saw their net worth explode nominally. The people holding cash saw their purchasing power collapse.
Exactly. And that is why the hook you mentioned earlier, understanding money is no longer optional, is so deeply true. In a hard money system, you could argue that financial ignorance is survivable. If the currency holds its value, you can just work hard, save your coins under the mattress, and retire with dignity. But in a fiat system that relies on persistent monetary expansion, standing still is actually moving backward on a treadmill. If you don't understand how to convert your labor into assets that appreciate alongside or faster than the M2 money supply growth, you will work your entire life and wonder why you are getting poorer. The rules of the game require you to be an investor, whether you want to be or not.
I am not sure that holds. Because what you are basically saying is that the entire population must become amateur fund managers just to survive. That is an impossible standard for a society. It suggests the only way to not be robbed by the system is to participate in risk assets, which inherently carry the risk of ruin.
It is an impossible standard. That is precisely why the wealth gap is widening to levels that cause social instability. I am not saying it is a good system or a fair system. I am saying it is the mechanical reality of the system we inhabit. When you have the M2 money supply sitting at roughly $22.7 trillion in early 2026, still growing at over 5% year over year while inflation hovers around 2.4%, the math simply dictates that cash is a melting ice cube. You don't have to be a hedge fund manager, but you do have to understand that the default setting of the currency is depreciation. If you don't step off the cash paradigm, you are structurally guaranteed to lose purchasing power.
But wait, we have to look at what the alternative is. If the central bank didn't expand the money supply during crises, we wouldn't just have stagnant purchasing power, we would have deflationary spirals, bankruptcies, massive unemployment. A little inflation is the grease in the wheels. It forces capital out of mattresses and into businesses, creating jobs.
That is the textbook Keynesian argument, and I don't dismiss it entirely. A mild, predictable inflation rate does disincentivize hoarding. If you know your money will lose 2% a year, you are motivated to invest it in a productive enterprise that might yield 5%. The problem is the magnitude and unpredictability we have seen recently. When 20% of all U.S. dollars in existence were created in the single year of 2020, as some analyses have shown, that is not greasing the wheels. That is flooding the engine. It creates massive distortions. Asset prices disconnect from underlying economic reality. Housing becomes unaffordable for an entire generation because homes stop being shelters and become the primary vehicle for inflation hedging. When people realize cash is decaying, they flee into tangible assets. driving the prices of those assets out of reach for wage earners.
It turns housing into a financial product rather than a utility.
A purely defensive financial product. People buy a third house not because they need somewhere to sleep, but because they need a vessel to store their purchasing power that the central bank cannot print more of. And you see this across the board. The rise of alternative stores of value, from precious metals to digital assets, is entirely a symptom of a deep, pervasive mistrust in the fiat currency's ability to retain value over time. It is a rational response to an environment where the denominator, the total amount of money, is constantly being manipulated.
This brings us back to the generational impact. You mentioned the Truth in Accounting study showing an 84% decline in purchasing power for $100 since 1975. Does that actually matter if wages have also risen? A worker makes vastly more nominal dollars today than in 1975.
It matters because the inflation metric we use, the CPI, doesn't capture the full picture of living standards. Yes, nominal wages have risen. And if you look at consumer electronics, the purchasing power of an hour of labor has exploded. You can buy incredible computing power today for a fraction of what a basic television cost decades ago. But the things that actually secure a stable life, housing, healthcare, higher education, energy, have often outpaced wage growth. So the dollar buys more distraction, but less security. That is the devastating part of the devaluation. It alters the structure of what a middle-class life looks like. You are earning more dollars, but those dollars are increasingly impotent when it comes to buying structural stability.
I hear you, but I keep getting stuck on the idea that this is some hidden theft. The inflation rate is published monthly. The M2 supply is public data from the Federal Reserve. Anyone can see it. It is not a secret conspiracy. It is public policy.
It is public policy, but it is obscured by complexity. The average person does not track M2 growth. They don't monitor the Fed's balance sheet or quantitative tightening schedules. They just know they are working harder and feeling poorer. The policy language is entirely sanitized. We talk about providing liquidity and managing the yield curve. We don't say, we're going to slowly dilute the purchasing power of your life savings to manage sovereign debt burdens. If you explain the mechanics plainly, that fiat currency is unbacked debt and its supply will be expanded whenever politically expedient, people would view their bank accounts very differently.
So the solution for the listener is to stop looking at their bank balance as a scoreboard and start looking at it as a temporary holding pen.
Precisely. Money is a tool for transferring value across space and time. If the tool is defective, if it leaks value over time, you cannot store your labor in it indefinitely. You have to convert it. That requires an entirely new set of skills. It requires understanding risk, understanding asset classes, and recognizing that doing nothing with your money is actually an active decision to slowly surrender your wealth.
We are operating in a system that demands participation. Staying on the sidelines just means you're the one paying for the expansion. It is a harsh reality, but ignoring it doesn't change the math.
It doesn't. The historical data on purchasing power decay is unambiguous. The shift in mindset from saving to allocating is the only defense available.
That feels like a heavy place to land, but a necessary one. We have traced the mechanics of money printing, the silent erosion of the dollar, and the structural gap it creates. Send this conversation to someone who still thinks a high-yield savings account is the finish line.